to change my major to African American Studies, the first PhD offering program was at Temple University. And so that kind of inspired me. So I changed majors. And the rest is history. I'll talk about that as I speak on Idlewild. Idlewild was not initially one of my research areas. My research first began studying pop culture, rap music and hip hop. But I fell in love with the outdoor leisure life. And so that's what led me to my work on Idlewild. So first of all, I want to thank the invitation to speak during this Black History Month and talk about Idlewild. It's one of my favorite topics. And what I'll do as I'm talking is I'll show some images, but I really want to try to survey and give you a sense of what was happening in the United States of America when Idlewild was being founded, what happened as it flourished and developed, what happened as it suffered socioeconomic decline, and then try to revisit some of the more contemporary renewed an interest in Idlewild. And in the midst of talking about that, I'm going to talk about race. So I think it's important to look at what was happening in the United States during the latter part of the 19th century, right after the Civil War and into the era of what we know as Reconstruction, and what happened around 1896 with the Supreme Court decision on Plessy versus Ferguson, and what was happening in the Black community. There was a movement taking place that involved a lot of educated, and I wouldn't say wealthy, but let's say well-to-do African Americans who felt like they deserved the same rights and privileges as white America. They had the education, they had the income, and they were widely traveled. This was during an era, most of you probably heard of the Harlem Renaissance, but I want to talk about a larger movement within the constructs of the Harlem Renaissance called the New Negro Movement. So at the end of the 19th century, there were some resorts that were popping up for African Americans, and the reason why is that those people that I was speaking about, the Black middle and upper class, weren't allowed, they were prohibited from traveling to white resort communities. And so they began to come up with ways to carve out their own space. So the first Black resort that was established was on Martha's Vineyard, a little piece of that area called Oaks Bluff. That was in 1893. And then what followed the same year as Frederick Douglass's death, 1895, was Highland Beach in Maryland. So then what we see happening as we go into the turn of the century, there's a migration. This is the beginning of the Great Migration. And so many of those middle and upper class African Americans were moving out of southern communities and into northern communities, mostly the big cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Indianapolis, places like that. And as they were relocating there was some tensions in those cities. For example, in Chicago, there was a riot, a red riot called 1919. And then shortly after that, in 1921, there was the Tulsa race riot. Now, I should note that Idlewild was founded in 1912, and it was founded by white land developers. Let me see if I can find an image really quickly for you. Okay, so having problems with the PowerPoint, but it was founded by white land developers who were in the resort business in Western Michigan. Now, two of these developers came out of Newaygo County, which is a neighboring county from Lake County. Lake County is where Idlewild sits in Yates Township. And Newaygo County, the Branch brothers, and they partnered with a team in Chicago. These are white land developers and their wives who homesteaded a piece of Idlewild in 1912. We know it as the island today, or Williams Island, but in 1912, it was called, it was Crook Lake, which is now Idlewild Lake. And the lake was pretty large, and it was divided. There was a small Crook Lake and a larger Crook Lake. These white land developers formed this organization called the Idlewild Resort Company. And by 1915, because their idea was that the Negro, there was a Negro community, a market, where they were not allowed to go into the white resorts. And so they intentionally founded Idlewild as a location in the middle of the Manistee National Forest for Black people. That was in 1915. One of the most prominent figures to join that excursion was a Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who happened to be the first surgeon to successfully perform open heart surgery in the US. That was in the latter part of the 19th century. Dr. Williams was also a co-founder of the first colored hospital in Chicago called Providence Hospital. You see, this was during the era of Jim Crow segregation. And that meant that there were locations, restaurants, drinking fountains, etc., that designated locations for Black folks. They called them colored versus white only locations. And so Dr. Dan was having some problems with one of his colleagues in Chicago and elected to retire. And he selected Idlewild as a location to retire. Now, by doing this, the Idlewild Resort Company believed that it was to their benefit and to the Black community's benefit to turn the island over to Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who was also an entrepreneur. He was the president of the Idlewild Improvement Association. And he and his associates was putting the finishing touches on what was then called the island. That is, the island had a hotel called Oaksmere. It also had, for some reason I cannot find my PowerPoint, which I could before. I'll keep going. So it had this hotel, Oaksmere Hotel, and it had a clubhouse. And the clubhouse was the centralizing place for African Americans. If I can retrieve my PowerPoint, I will share it and show you images of the clubhouse and the people who catered to it. So at the same time that the island was being developed, another section of Idlewild, because Idlewild consists of 7 or 8 different, there we go. Yeah, that's the clubhouse. Thank you, whoever did that. And this image here of the clubhouse is in the 50s. So when I talk about this transition period, you'll see where I'm trying to go with this. Where did I leave off? There were 7 other different subdivisions, and another one was called Paradise Gardens. So one of the other, a couple, Herman and Leela Wilson, they invested in something like 353 acres in the Paradise Gardens section. And then there were some others to follow that. You see, Idlewild sits in the middle of Yates Township, and Yates Township consists of 2,700 acres of land, but then Idlewild was the village, the centralizing, sort of like the village or the city within this township. So a much smaller set of spaces, but within the confines of 2,700 acres of land. So some of the noteworthy people who was invited to Idlewild by Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. One of the most important was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was co-founder of the NAACP and editor of Crises magazine. And when Du Bois came to Idlewild, he was so impressed because he thought that as what happened in 1877 was that this was the 1877 was the exodus from the South into Kansas. And the people who first joined that first group of voluntary migrants, they were tricked. There was no water. It was in the middle of Kansas, but they went there to build a town called Nicodemus, Kansas. And Du Bois had written about that. And so being the scholar that he was, being the intellect that he was, that's him right there. This is during his visit in 1919. He comes to Idlewild and he makes this statement in 1920, publishes an article in the Crises. And he says, for sheer physical beauty, for sheen of water and golden air, for nobleness of tree and flower and shrub, for shiny river and song of bird, and the low, moving whisper of sun, moon, and star. It is the beautiful stretch I have seen in 20 years. And then to add fellowship, sweet, strong women and keen-witted men from Canada and Texas, California and New York, Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, all sons and great-grandchildren of Ethiopia, all with the wide leisure of rest and play. Can you imagine a more marvelous thing than Idlewild? And in that same article, he wrote this, because remember now, the country is divided and there's spaces for Black folks and there's spaces for white folks. And he says, now white men developed Idlewild. They recognized its beauty, brought it, and attracted people there. They have made money by the operation. That was their object, but they have not squeezed the lemon dry. And they have apparently been absolutely open, square, and just. Idlewild, every penny paid for it. It is worth a good deal more than most people paid for it. Our hats off are to the Idlewild Resort Company. And indeed, they lived up to that, that declaration. So when they left the island, they developed another subdivision in Idlewild called Idlewild Terrace. And in Idlewild Terrace, they moved their headquarters there. They had a small museum. It was right by one of the lakes, one of the 6 lakes in Idlewild. Idlewild has 6 lakes. So people continued to come, and it was becoming so popular that these other subdivisions, which were not a part of Idlewild, became a part of the Idlewild narrative. Someone else that was important that came was Madam C.J. Walker, who was the first Black female millionaire out of New York. She lived in New York, Chicago, and Indianapolis. She toured Idlewild once, had planned to set up a beauty school there, but died a year later. That was in 1918, and she passed in 1919. And then, of course, another important figure, one of my heroes, was an attorney out of Chicago by the name of Violet Neely Anderson, who was born in England, but at a young age, her parents migrated to Chicago, Illinois, and this lady became the first Black female to earn a law degree in Illinois, the first Black female lawyer, the first Black female assistant prosecutor, and the first Black female lawyer to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It happened that she was also the first person to get married in Idlewild. And she was a member of one of the sororities, Zeta Phi Beta, And before her death, she donated her home, her Idlewild cottage, to her sorority, which they celebrate every year to this day. So to speed this up, I would argue that from 1915 until the beginning of 1940 or mid 1940s, that Idlewild, two things. It was mostly controlled by Black entrepreneurs out of Chicago, and two, it was recognized, like in the title of my first book, The Black Eden of Michigan, but the Black Eden of Michigan was recognized as a cultural and intellectual site for Black middle class individuals and their families. During the years of the Depression, after the stock market crash of 1929, I believe, and into the 1930s, Idlewild continued to flourish. People at that time stayed in places like Idlewild. They spent the entire summers. Mostly mothers and the children, and the fathers would like migrate back and forth, travel back and forth, while working. So, most of the dads, they lived in Detroit or Chicago, and we're talking in either direction, a good 250-mile drive. You see, when Henry Ford produced the automobile in the early part of the 20th century, there were African Americans who had the income that could afford an automobile. And Dr. Dan and Madam C.J. Walker were just a list of two of those figures. Our nation's highways were being developed. They fully didn't get developed until the next era in Idlewild in the 1950s. So that gets me to this point of focusing, when we look at Idlewild, and focuses on its diversity in terms of the new Negro movement, or what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented 10th in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, I think published 1909, and versus the Summer Apollo of Michigan, then Idlewild becomes a really important site. So by the 1950s, that is after the Second World War, you have a number of African-American troops that are returning home from the war. They want to spend money, they want to have a good time. You have hotels being built. President Eisenhower in the early 50s, one of the high marks of his presidency was the expansion of the highway system. And so now you have, because of places like Detroit with the automobile industry, and Chicago with the steel industry, and of course other labor intensive occupations, you have African Americans now who have greater mobility. They got a greater opportunity and chance to travel throughout the United States. Speaking of that, I should go back. In the early part of Idlewild, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Green Book. The Green Book was published by a New York postal worker by the name of Victor Green, and roughly around, I think the first issue was in 1936. Well, Idlewild had already been in the mindset of most African-American vacationers, but the Green Book was a tool used for Black travelers. That is, it listed places where they can go and eat at restaurants, where they can gas up their automobiles, and where they could lodge, city by city, state by state. That's the Green Book. Idlewild was listed from the very first issue of the Green Book until the last issue, roughly in 1966. So back to the 50s. So during the 50s, there's a new, the political climate has changed. In the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which was an attempt to reverse the decision made in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. And then you had the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and the killing of Emmett Till in 1955. So many civil rights scholars argue that it was the Montgomery bus boycott that gave an impetus to the civil rights movement. Others say it was the Emmett Till, then still others say that it was during President Harry Truman's presidency, the latter part of the 1940s, in which he integrated part of the military. Whichever the case, Idlewild is flourishing as a community during the 1950s, and its identity shifts from the new Negro to the summer Apollo. Weekly, Black and white fans are sitting in nightclubs in Idlewild, which it had 3 nightclubs at the time. The most popular was called the Paradise Club. And on any weekend, you can go to Idlewild and into the Paradise Club and see Della Reese, T-Bone Walker, B.B. King. He only came once in 1958. Little Willie John, Etta James, the Four Tops. They were teenagers when they started performing in Idlewild. And so the list goes on and on. You can see first class entertainment, especially with Jackie Wilson, that's the Paradise Club, Jackie Wilson and Aretha Franklin, who came years later. And of course, understanding now, this is an era in Black history where Black parents gave permission to nightclub owners like Arthur Bragg's, and of course they accompanied their teen children, because the Four Tops, they were probably 16, 17 years old when they first started performing, and before they signed up with Motown. They started in Idlewild, and they toured with Arthur Bragg's, they and their parents. So it was a spot for these very popular entertainers. And for people who lived in Idlewild year round, the numbers have never been really high. I think back then, it was about 490 people that lived there year round. But on any given summer in the 1950s, Idlewild occupied at least 2,500 visitors on any weekend throughout the 50s. But some other things started happening as the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and Dr. King, as he became a very important symbolic figure, with the help of Lyndon B. Johnson during his presidency, that is after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, November of 63, there was an initiative by Johnson where he signed into legislation the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which supposedly had ended legal segregation, and a year later, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So, notwithstanding the gains from the fact that Idlewild was designated by former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, this was in 2000, 21st century, she designated it as a national treasure as it marked the centennial celebration in 2012. Years before that decision, a restructuring of community resources 8 years ago presented other challenges for township officials. You see, in the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were signed into law, that for most people in the African American community marked a new era. The rhetoric in the civil rights movement at that time was on integration. And so Black folks bought into integration, and many of those middle-class families now that had properties in Idlewild abandoned Idlewild, as well as the entrepreneurs. And so they had their eyes set on other possibilities. But as Sonny Wilson and Ben Wilson, one of the other books that's written by, 2 other books written about Idlewild, observed, and it's in Black Eden, the Idlewild community, the African Americans' push towards integration and the civil rights movement at the time presented severe challenges for Idlewild by initiating changes that not only crippled its economic base, but also resulted in profound, unintentional consequences for virtually every aspect of the Idlewild community. Idlewild suffered as more and more African Americans frequent white resort areas for leisure, amusement, and recreation. At the time, the white patrons who had formerly patronized the Idlewild community stopped visiting and spending their dollars in the area. Clearly, while the legal and social gains emanating from the civil rights movement may have helped to alter societal norms and perceptions regarding major structural changes in American life and fundamental rights therein, these victories did not necessarily include opportunities for economic development among the citizens and abandoned entrepreneurs in the Idlewild community. So the community of Idlewild is now over 100 years old, and many residents feel it is time to discuss its creation as a legal entity and other options. As a community, Idlewild has no political power while providing a large amount of tax dollars for Yates Township and Lake County citizens. As a community, Idlewild is subject to annotation and are controlled by external forces other than the residents of the community. I just want to kind of ad-lib and say something about what are the lessons we can learn about Idlewild and what is happening today. First of all, we learned that Idlewild was a viable Black institution that can claim some sense of independence for well over 60 years. Secondly, that with the victories of the civil rights movement, some Black vacationers became increasingly dislocated, divided, and consequently either abandoned the institution, became disinterested, or contributed to its demise over petty jealousy. Third, that despite these setbacks, some Black folks continue to invest a great deal of their time, energy, effort, and finances to preserve Idlewild by improving their properties, building new homes, and dedicated historical markers. Let me just pause for a second. So with that celebration, that 100-year celebration centennial in 2012, another historical event happened in Idlewild in the state of Michigan. Idlewild became the first spot in the state of Michigan that laid down 6 markers in one day. That was the first time that it ever happened in the state. Back to this. Like the residents of contemporary Detroit who have endured years of blight, political corruption, and abandonment of parks, playgrounds, and entire neighborhoods, some Idlewild residents began taking things into their own hands to fight back through entrepreneurship, encouraging younger people to take pride in Black ownership, and by asking critical questions about what should the future of Idlewild look like. Then the last, that in this so-called post-racial society, there remains still a need for viable Black institutions in places like Idlewild to nurture and develop Black talents. Now, today, I don't know how many of you are keeping up on, what events have happened in Michigan with attempts to kidnap the governor of Michigan because of the COVID-19 spread. There are militia groups, a large number of them in Idlewild or in Michigan, particularly in Western and Northern Michigan. And I'm a property owner in Idlewild now. And just not even a month ago, I was traveling there and I found myself driving behind a truck, was taking shortcuts from Muskegon to Idlewild. And I found myself driving behind a truck with a big Confederate flag. Now, one of the main streets to get to Idlewild is a US 10 route. And on US 10, on one side of US 10 is Weber Township. On the other side is Lake Township, where Idlewild sits. One of my former students, when I taught at West Shore Community College, sold real estate She had one of those marketplaces because she had formerly worked in tourism on ships. So she traveled all around the world and collected lots of art. And so one of the buildings directly across the street from where Idlewild is now owned by another individual, a Trump supporter. And there's a big, humongous sign, Donald Trump, we're not taking this anymore. And it's like a threat to Idlewild. And so there are rumors that people say things like, that's nigger town, you know. So I suppose where I'm trying to go with this presentation is we still have a problem of race. It was race that built Idlewild. In the days that Dr. Daniel L. Williams was there, some really important developments in terms of creating racial harmony occurred. You see, Dr. Dan had retired from the medical field and was becoming this entrepreneur. But in the neighboring town, the village, the county seat, Baldwin, Michigan, at one of the banks there, one of the employees became severely sick, and Dr. Daniel L. Williams, this is back in the 1920s. This is before 1925 because he became sick in 1925 and he died in 1931. So this is before 1925. One of the white employees became sick and Dr. Dan came out of retirement, healed him, and that fostered a very important relationship between Baldwin, Michigan, the residents of Baldwin, and the residents of Idlewild. I mean, it opens up all kinds of doors because the lumber company was in Baldwin. The electricians were in Baldwin. You know, all of the stores, the banks were in Baldwin. And so that was an important intersectionality between the citizens of Baldwin and the citizens of Idlewild. And that has, over the years, been nurtured. And so to experience knowing this, and then to observe and see what is going on in the 21st century, it kind of is a disappointing narrative because the people in Idlewild are trying to build their community. Many that I've interviewed and talked to state that, you know, their renewed interest is basically because they didn't feel safe or feel wanted at other places that they've been going to, so they decided to reinvest. And all of this is taking place from roughly 2010 to the present. And so it's kind of saddened that, you know, there's a lot of big lies out there with information about the African-American experience. Is not a homogeneous culture. And they're, you know, from the earliest periods, as I just shared, you know, Idlewild was founded by white land developers, and white people have always been welcome to Idlewild. And so to see these negative characterizations in 2020, 21 is kind of disappointing. So I'll stop there. I hope I'm under my 30 minutes so I have time to answer as many questions as you might have.
I have a question. I was just going to ask you about how much, and if they has Idlewild then downsized from like its prime days, and if like the quality of the facilities are still being invested in by its residents?
Good question. Okay, the year-round population has increased. So back in the 50s, there was roughly, let's say 450 people that lived there year-round. Today, there's roughly about 900 that live around. In the 50s, in terms of the, what I call seasonal residents, that is people who live other places, but they're property owners in Idlewild, those numbers have decreased somewhat. And in terms of the visitors, a significant increase. So there used to be 2,500 people, 1,000 people that, you know, would converge on Idlewild, but that ain't happening today. And I think the numbers year during the summer months used to be hit the mark of about 15, maybe 10,000. Today it's about 5,000. So there's continued interest. In terms of the hotels, grocery stores, they had, at one point in the 50s, Idlewild had 3 hotels, about 50 motels, about 60 rental cottages, a skating rink, 3 nightclubs, 1 after-hour spot. It had a lot of resources. Today, there's 1 grocery store, there's 1 motel, no, 2 motels, no hotels. So it has suffered significantly in terms of resources that, where people can be accommodated when they're traveling away from home. There are more homes built in Idlewild, more modern homes. The homes in the 1920s and 30s were what you call cottages, or like summer homes that did not have the installation. Today, people are building very nice homes with installations. So those are the sort of comparisons or changes that have occurred over the years.
I think George Marks has a question, so he can go ahead and speak.
What can we do as people that might care about Idlewild to help support it, both its historic importance and its present significance?
I think forums like this helps. I think young students, students can make a big difference. Visiting. I think there are opportunities. I don't want to call them internships, but I think there are people that are trying to develop opportunities for fellowships. So we need students there to. 4 years ago, Idlewild lost its public library. I've been preaching to the choir there because I believe any community that does not have a library is like a kiss of death, right? Because there's not promotion of literacy. So students that know have archival skills, library skills, interest in working in hospitality and tourism, those are all good markers of helping. I think, as the governor told me, the former governor, Jennifer Granholm, I asked her that very same question. And what she said was Idlewild needed a very wealthy benefactor. And she was speaking of either someone like an Oprah Winfrey, or at that time, Michigan State University was probably the one university that was investing the most resources in Idlewild, but a university that would bring some legitimacy and bring the kind of resources that it needs. That's the short answer, George. Other questions?
Yeah, I guess I had a question. So you kind of touched on like how it was like part of like the Harlem like Renaissance, like so many like influential people went to Idlewild. So like, do you think that if we hadn't, or if Idlewild really hadn't been there, we wouldn't really be like seeing such like great like literary and like musical like successes be so prevalent?
Try to rephrase that question for me so I make sure I understand.
Yeah, like you were saying, like a lot of like musicians and like writers would like go and like collaborate and kind of like work, and they produced a lot of stuff while they were at Idlewild. So I guess I was just wondering, like, do you think Idlewild was like really significant to like how big the Harlem Renaissance ended up being?
I think it played a role as a resort. I think again, the Harlem Renaissance, it was the mood. It's sort of like, I'm going to try to do the comparison like this. Like Black Lives Matter, they had all this contesting of it. But if you watch Netflix and Hulu, they got a Black Lives Matter collective where you can watch Black films through that connection, right? Where the Harlem Renaissance was sort of like that collected of the new Negro movement. It wasn't the only thing, because the Harlem Renaissance was mostly literary in context. But with the new Negro movement, it wasn't just about literary. It was about doctors, bankers, savings and loans, moving companies, intellectuals like Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, the father of the Black History Month. So it was a lot of things, if that makes sense. So I think, I don't know if it would have compared to the Harlem Renaissance. I think it would have been sort of equal to it. It would have been a popular destination. I mean, you think about it, Jamaica, the Bahamas, people go on tours every year, right? And they go to these places. And so Idlewild would have been sort of like one of those places on a continuous basis, had it not suffered economically.
If there are no more questions, I'm just going to conclude with thanking you, Doctor, for coming to talk to us today. And thank you to everyone who attended. Please stay in tune, because we're going to be having a resource list coming out shortly based on this discussion. And happy Black History Month, everybody, and have a nice day.
Okay, well, before you conclude, let me just say one more thing. So if you all ever get a chance to travel to Idlewild, the best time to go is after Memorial Day and before Labor Day. There's a number of activities taking place, music festivals, an oasis. They even have like an oasis with tents out, it's becoming more widely popular. They have an international film festival. Again, there are lots of people that are on the go in Idlewild and trying to rebuild and reshape the community. So it's a really fun place. And the other cool thing is not just in Lake County, in Mason County, where Ludington, Michigan is, where I live, right off of Lake Michigan. There's beaches there. So it's like other locales within the vicinity where one could travel there and do more than one thing. And if you're a fisher person, somebody that likes to fish, it's a great paradise for that. Again, they got 6 lakes. They're the cleanest lake in the state of Lake County. Lake County, Michigan has 150 lakes, and Idlewild has 6 of the cleanest. I'll end on that note.
All right. Thanks again, and thank you for everyone that came. Stay tuned, I guess. We're gonna post some, like Edie said, resources on our Instagram page and on our website to follow up with this. And then we'll have our next webinar next month. And yeah, so just stay tuned, and bye.
Bye.